are ready, finally. I'd like to welcome you all to Devil's Gate. We have a few people still wandering in, which is good. And we have a wonderful speaker here tonight from the Botanical Gardens. And we appreciate her coming, Amy. Appreciate you coming up here this far to be with us. And right now, I have the can at home because I just left the store. So anyway, this is what we'll use for the can tonight. Remember, we always add a little bit to this because, after all, the community center is on its own, and we are here having the use of the community center, and we want to thank our camera lady, our photo lady, whatever.
I'm taking my 7th grade AV class.
Our media specialist.
Media specialist.
And without further ado, I'd like to
I'll introduce you. Because we've got to do double introductions. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm going to introduce Amy Schneider because we met, well, I've heard around town that there was this woman wanting to know about Greymont. And we know it's a small town, so it's fine, Christine, well, okay, they're the following places normally. But I just knew someone wanted to know about Greymont, and I was like, well, why? And then lo and behold, you made it over to the archives at the old school. And she did want to know about Greymont. She also wanted to know about the Kelso cabin and asked me, did I know where it was? And it was like, well, it's Stevens, I knew kind of where it was within 2 miles, but not the rest of it. Anyway, it started a fun set of correspondence back and forth. Could we figure out where it was? What could we do? And everything else. And when I hear people that are interested in topics that relate to us, of course, then I say things like, would you like to do a Devil's Gate talk? So Amy Schneider is the assistant curator at the Denver Botanic Gardens. All right, and I'm looking forward to this. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Oh yes, we've got to get you mic'd up. We could try this one more time. Shall we see if wireless will work? Somebody in the AV class forgot to charge up the wireless headset. It's looking good.
It's working.
Okay, if you put that on, then we'll try. And if it goes off in the middle, we'll go back to the one that's plugged in.
Okay.
What are you getting any?
Okay. Is that good?
No, I don't think I can hear you. Tom,
Okay.
Yes.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay.
I can hear it.
All right.
And you have to consider our age also.
I know. I can't hear it at all, so I've got to have it loud. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for inviting me to come speak about this, my favorite topic, people from 1887. I don't exactly know what year it was, but I think it was 2021. And I was at work in our herbarium IDing some grasses that I had collected in the Alpine. And the staff in the herbarium, Jennifer Ackerfield and Margot, they came over to me after lunch and they said, Amy, come do our fun thing with us. And I was like, okay. And the fun thing was to watch an interview with this author, Barbara Thiers, who was at the time the director of the herbarium at New York Botanic Gardens. And it was about a half an hour, and it just went through this book documenting the history of herbaria all over the world. And this book just looked so much fun, and I just went out immediately and ordered it. And when I got it, I was sitting there reading it one night, and I came to this part about the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. And they started talking about this couple that started the herbarium called the Brandegees, and how they then invited Alice Eastwood from Denver to come and work in their herbarium one summer because they wanted her to help them document and identify some of the plant species. So it went on to talk about how Alice Eastwood met Alfred Russel Wallace here in Colorado, and they went on a collecting trip together on Gray's Peak in July of 1887. And I was just shocked because I thought that Alfred Russel Wallace had lived years before Eastwood was even born. I mean, he made his discovery of natural selection and survival of the fittest in 1858. And she lived until 1953. So I was very surprised to find out that their lifetimes overlapped and that they were adults at the same age, and they went on this hike together in Colorado. Alfred Russel Wallace was from England, and I wanted to see which species they had collected on Grays. So I started looking through our online catalog, and when you research the collector, you can see all the collections they have ever made in their life. And Alice Eastwood only had 2 plants from 1887 in July on Gray's Peak, and they were both these willows. But she went back the next year in 1888 and collected over 150 species. So I was like, how am I gonna find out what plants they collected? So I was on a trip in London, and I went to this, it's a museum called the Linnaean Society of London, and it's right across the street in Bloomsbury from Fortnum and Mason, the famous grocery store. And there I saw that they had all of Wallace's papers. There is just a mountain of his correspondence and his journals. And this is the cover of the actual journal he kept when he came to North America in 1886. And he was here for almost a year, from October 1886 through, I think it was September of 1887. There it is. So I started to want to find out more and more about these 2 people, because I thought Alice Eastwood was already a famous botanist in San Francisco. How else would she ever have met Alfred Russel Wallace, who is probably the most famous naturalist in the entire world? I mean, it was like how we say the names Albert Einstein and Jane Goodall. People knew who this man was, and I was like, why was he here? And he was 67 years old. This is an actual photo of him taken on his North American trip, so that's what he would have looked like at 67. This photo of Alice Eastwood, it's about 3 years before 1887, but she looks the same in every single photo. Like, this woman's face did not change. So I just want to start with telling you a little bit more about Alfred Russel Wallace. I could talk about him all day, but I just want to tell you why he was here in America, and it's all because of his discovery about the mechanism of how evolution works. And he was on this little island right here. I want to use the pointy thing. See the red circle? This is the island that he lived on for 12 years. He went all over all these islands. Like, he was there for 12 years collecting birds, bees, butterflies, and he didn't really make any herbarium vouchers. And that's the other thing I was confused about. Why on earth would he be here in the Rockies looking at alpine plants? But this is the little house that he lived on in the island, and where he made his discovery one night when he was very sick with malaria. He started thinking about, if you ever get the chance to read his book, The Malay Archipelago, he talks all about his discovery. And he was, he just amassed this huge collection of birds. He started thinking about like his entire collection, asking questions about it, and then looking at his own work to find answers. And he started with mother birds, and that is what triggered him on, and the whole idea he said it came to him like a flash. And he said the mother bird is sitting on the nest with her gray, tan, brown, and white speckled feathers. And why is her color like that when the male bird is flashy and brilliantly green and yellow or whatever. And he realized it's to camouflage the mother and the eggs from any predators. And that is what was the gateway idea. And he just realized, like, here's how they survived, this. And that's what happened and how he became this famous evolution scientist. And what did he do but sit down and write a letter to Charles Darwin? Now, Darwin had finished his trip on the Beagle in 1836 or something. He had been back in London for over 20 years. He never told anybody about the discovery of natural selection and survival of the fittest. Instead, he was sitting there writing this book for 20 years, and he's like, well, my book is going to be almost like a set of encyclopedias. It's going to be a multi-volume book, and I'm going to talk about all these different species and how they evolve. But he says he got this letter in 1858 and became completely, I don't know what the word is, like upset that here's this young whippersnapper, Alfred Russel Wallace, you know, coming in on his territory, and he completely freaked out. And he said, he wrote a letter to his best friend, Charles Lyell, who was a geologist. And he said, I can't believe the coincidence. And a lot of people, there's a huge group of people who are pro-Wallace. And they don't think that Darwin got that letter in June. They think he got that letter way before. They even hired these postal historians to go back and look at all the schedules, because Wallace also wrote a letter to his brother-in-law, his father-in-law, and another friend called Henry Bates. So I don't know, that's all I'm going to say. I mean, you can read all about it like I've done and draw your own conclusions. But this is a picture of the inside of the Linnaean Society of London, where they have all of Wallace's papers and journals. This is where they read his beautiful essay. When you read that essay, it is just crystal clear. It's amazing. And he just spells the whole thing out in the most simple and like beautiful, concise terms. And they also read an abstract that Darwin had written to Charles Lyell, and it was just a real, like a little summary, almost like a synopsis of the mechanism of evolution. But when I read it, I'm like, I don't even know what he's talking about. And then they also read a letter that Darwin wrote to Asa Gray, who Gray's Peak is named after. And Darwin said, oh, Asa, you know, and he starts talking about evolution. And the other thing that just makes me wonder is, there's two more things that make me wonder. Asa Gray was a botanist. He was the head of the herbarium at Harvard for years. But he also was a devout, hardcore Roman Catholic. And he did not accept evolution for a very long time, except for regarding plants. He did not believe it happened to people. And so this letter is mostly about species distribution, which is how they thought evolution worked. Like, why was this species here, here, and here, and not there? And the other thing that really makes a lot of people wonder is that the night they read Wallace's letter to the Linnaean Society, the letter disappeared. They had a transcriber writing down what the letter said, so that's what we know, but the letter is gone. And nobody can find it. It has never been found, and the only reason that those Wallace people think it disappeared is because of the date that Wallace wrote on the top. Now, Wallace stayed in Indonesia for another like 5 or 6 years, but when he came home, he was just immediately embraced by the scientific community. They loved him, and he continued to write letters to Darwin until Darwin's death. he wrote letters to all the other people in the Linnaean Society, and they were just hashing out details of evolution. When Darwin died, Wallace was a pallbearer at his funeral, along with another man called James Lowell of the Lowell Institute of Boston. And James Lowell said to Wallace, "Hey, if you ever want to come on one of my speaking tours, I will pay you $50 a lecture," which back then was like, I don't even know how much, like $300 today. I don't know, I just made that number up. But Wallace was like, okay, I'll do it, because he was married. He had a set of twins and a daughter, and he decided that he was going to come to North America and go on this speaking tour. So he started off on the East Coast, and he had 10 lectures set up by the Lowell Institute. And then as he was there, the newspapers kept saying, "Oh, last night there was a talk by Alfred Russel Wallace and his famous opaque projector." He built a little opaque projector out of a lantern and was like shining pictures on the wall that he had hand colored of like tropical birds and chameleons and stuff like that. And people were just eating it up because he was a great speaker and he was so much fun. And so they'd say, "Oh, now you're in Washington, D.C. Can you come across to Western Maryland? Oh, now you're here. Can you come further west?" And he started like traveling more and more into the United States. He was in Chicago. He went to Iowa. He went to Kansas. And when he got to St. Louis, he was kind of like, "Well, you know, I've been here about 6 months. I miss my kids. I don't know what I should do." And he spent a day at what is now the Missouri Botanic Garden, just kind of walking around. And he decided that he was going to go for it and go all the way across to San Francisco and see his brother John Wallace, who was a famous, famous railroad engineer. His brother John has a town named after him in California, and he's the one who engineered or helped engineer the railroad through the Sierras. And Wallace and his brother, they had not seen each other for so long, 40 years, and he really wanted to see him, and he also really wanted to see the giant sequoias. So that's what he did, and he got on the train, worked his way across Kansas, and the train came here to Denver. This is what the train station, Union Station, looked like in 1887, so this is what Wallace would have seen. This is Wine Coop Street. And he got to Denver about, I think it was, whoops. Sorry. Okay, this is the page from his journal. He got into Denver about 7 o'clock in the morning, and at 8:20 he had breakfast. When he finished, he used to write down everything. And he went to the 2 newspapers, and then, for some reason that none of us know, he decided to go over to the high school. This is the original Denver East High. And ask if anybody there knew of a botanist, because he saw the Rocky Mountains coming at him on the train, and he was like, "Oh my gosh, I want to go to the Rockies, and I want to go see some alpine plants, because I haven't seen an alpine plant since my honeymoon in Switzerland." So he walked into the school, and this is a very famous historic educator, James Baker, who was the principal at the time. And he asked them, you know, like, is there a college professor of botany anywhere at these local schools? And James Baker said, "You don't need a college professor. You need my history teacher, Miss Alice Eastwood, because every single summer, all she does is travel around in the Rockies, collect plants, press them, and use them to teach classes." She taught science and history, and that morning she was teaching a history class. And so they went into her classroom, and they waited in the back till she was done talking, and it was lunchtime, so all the kids went out of the room. and she was introduced to Wallace, and of course she knew who he was. And she showed him some plants that she had collected from Pikes Peak. And then they spent a couple hours together. And then they decided that in July, he was going to go, okay, so he was going to go leave the train that day and go all the way to San Francisco, spend May and June there. And then on his way back in July, they were going to go somewhere in Colorado and collect plants. And she was the perfect guide. So for a long time, I was like, why in the world would this famous person walk into a high school and see if, like, does anybody know anything about alpine plants? And I was like, it must have had something to do with his timetable. So I went over to the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, and the volunteer there was very helpful. He thought I was a little crazy. But over here it says, oops, sorry. Over here it says that it arrived in Denver at like 7:20 or 7:15. That's why he finished breakfast at 8:20. And then he had to leave. That's the train that's coming from the east across. And he had to get on here, the train to Cheyenne, and it left at 3. So I was like, oh, of course, he didn't have time to go to a college. But it was just a total coincidence that he went to that high school, and there was Alice Eastwood. So, and then right here, I didn't notice this until later, that here's the schedule for Graymont. So that is the train that they took, and this is the July 1887 timetable, so this is the one they would have been looking at. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about Alice Eastwood before I start telling you about the trip. She was born in Toronto, Canada. She was the oldest in her family. She had a little sister, Katie, and a little brother named Sydney. She was...
Are we fading?
Your mic, the light's off.
Okay. All right, one moment. Your microphone's light is off, but yours is. So this has to be close to you.
Okay, well... How's that? Good?
A little more?
Little more?
A little more.
Little more? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll hold it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Don't point it at the mic where you're speaking. You can hold it here.
Oh, okay.
Just don't point the front of this.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
It's not your fault. The AV class didn't do their homework.
So we have, we do have a little memoir that Alice Eastwood wrote. It's just about 4 pages, and it's part of her archive at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. And she was, as I said, born in Toronto, and when she was 8 years old, her mother passed away. The father was absent a lot when she was a little girl. He kept coming to Denver. So I was like, oh, he must be here working in mines or trying to strike it rich. But I can never find his name on any employee directory that they have at the School of Mines. They have the Denver City Guides that I've looked through every year, where they would list Mr. Colin Eastwood, and then it would say what your occupation was, and then it would list your address. The thing that's strange is that he lived in not a house, but a hotel downtown, but they never listed his job, and it was a men's hotel. So when Alice's mother died, he got the little boy and brought him here to Denver and lived in this hotel with them. But I have no idea what he was doing for work, or what, how he like made any money to stay there. Alice and her sister, he took the girls and put them into a convent to be raised by nuns, not an orphanage, just a regular convent. And I don't know how he decided, like these women are going to take care of my daughters. But it was a really rough time in Alice's life. When you read her biography, she says that there was just nothing for them. They would live there and just basically sleep there and have meals. On her birthday, she would get a teaspoonful of honey as her birthday gift. So it was just a sad time, her childhood. But when she turned 12 years old, and I think that's because she was then old enough to go to work, Dad came out and got the girls and brought them here to Denver. She didn't start high school for a few years until she was 14, and she went to that same school that she taught at. She graduated as valedictorian, but the most important thing that happened to her, because for a long time I thought, how did this poor little girl with no parents, obviously they couldn't go on trips to the mountains, how did she ever get interested in our Colorado native flora? It was because of this family that hired her to be their nanny for their 2 little boys. The father's name is Jacob Shearer. He was the son of immigrants. His father was from Germany and his mother was from France. His wife both of her parents were from France, and they had all these kids. They lived in a mansion on Colfax Avenue, which I guess was like Millionaire's Row. And they would take her with them to the mountains, and they went to resorts like Twin Lake, and they'd go hiking, and they'd go to the Rockies, and that's where she first started seeing all these plants and becoming interested in them. And the family really, she was their nanny, but they really regarded her as one of their children because they bought her all these books. They bought her Coulter's Manual of Botany, which is the key to our native flora back then. And that's how she started collecting plants. And so when she graduated from high school as valedictorian, she then started teaching there in the fall and spent every summer of her life in the Rockies. I think that Jacob Shearer is the person who got her a free railroad pass from David Moffett. I'm like, how else would she have gotten a free train pass except for through her connections with the Shearer family? And she took the train everywhere. Like in July of 1887, when she went on this trip with Wallace, that was only for 4 or 5 days. She also, in July, we have all of her collections. She went to Pikes Peak. She went to, I can't remember, but 3 other places just in the month of July alone. And the only place she didn't really like going to collect was in Steamboat because she had to take the train. I think she took it up north, and then she'd get on a horse and she'd ride the horse for like 85 miles into Steamboat. And I'm like, was she getting off at like Laramie or Cheyenne? I don't know where she was. But she just was a completely self-taught botanist, and she did know she could identify all the plants in the alpine. So she became his guide. This is a picture here, of the train rail, and it ends at Graymont. Alfred Russel Wallace said that was the end of the line. Right here is the Argentine and Grails Peak Railway ticket office. This is that white building that's right next door to Union Station. The Oxford Hotel is right next to it. I know you've seen this building, it's so beautiful. And right up here is a mezzanine floor, and that's where I used to get my hair cut. So they took the train out of Denver on the 19th, and it left at 8 a.m. to Graymont, and they got there at 1:30. Now, I'm sure you guys know this because you're the Historical Society, but this used to be a hugely popular tourist attraction. It cost $9. You'd get on this train, you'd come up here to Graymont, you would have a horse and a guide, you'd stay at the Jennings Hotel, which is right here. This is the back, oops, sorry. That's the back of, oops. That's the back of the Jennings Hotel where the train stops. And here you can see the train behind it, that's the front. This is right at the Bakerville exit. And they stayed there the first night. They went walking around after lunch and they found one of my favorite plants. This is in the wintergreen family, Pyrola rotundifolia. So the following day, so now it's July 20th, 1887. They hiked up from the Jennings Hotel all the way up to the Kelso cabin, which I'm like, I know this has got to be right by the trailhead because it's today's trailhead, because it was like a 3-mile hike. And he said we got to the Kelso cabin and then the Stevens mine. So this little picture here with the double image is from a stereoscope that they used to sell to people who would come on a train trip. And I'm like, you know what, when I go up there this summer, like last summer this is, we recreated the whole hike. We started down there at the Bakerville exit. We came up and we looked at the Kelso cabin. We're trying to find the foundation. And who did I see? Who did I run into here? This is Colin from Betty Ford Alpine Gardens. It was Colin, me, and 2 of the Betty Ford interns last summer. We went up there on July 19th and we recreated the whole hike and we collected all the same plants. But I'm like, I need to find these places. And that's why I came to Georgetown that one time. And I found Christine and I met her. And she didn't know it was July 19th. Yeah. Was that July 19th? I think it was. Or the 20th.
Oh, no, I didn't know that.
And I'm like, okay, this is the right day, July 20th. I gotta go find Kelso cabin because that's what they did. And so I'm walking down the road from the hut we stayed in, and I've got all my papers, and here comes this lady walking up the road. She's like, Amy, is that you?
I just said, are you looking for the Kelso cabin? And we had no idea. We had no idea you were going to be up there that day. Barb and Frank and I, it was just a nice day to go up, and so we went up and we were tooling around, and here comes this lady with papers walking down the Stevens Gulch Road, and nobody else walks around with papers other than Frank and me, you know, so that's how I figured that, you know, anyway, total fluke, but fun.
It was totally fun. And then here you see they have this,
Is this last summer, Chris?
Yeah.
see that white thing? That's their measuring tape, because Christine had the map and the measurements, and they knew it was a 40-foot by 20-foot structure. It could hold a lot of people. And so we had the picture, and what we're trying to do is to find that background of behind the mountains in that double image. And here's Colin pointing, trying to boss us. It's visual. Christine doesn't agree with him. Just kidding. And so, but we did find, you guys found it because I would never know. I think it was Barb. And she could see that this was once a foundation for a building, and it's right here.
Yeah, we found a lot of
You guys found a lot of
evidence.
Yeah, evidence.
Yeah.
Yep.
We didn't pick it up.
A substantial trash pile.
Yes.
So Wallace says we walked to Kelso's cabin in the Stevens mine, which of course we could still see those buildings and ruins. It was a fine upland valley just at Timberline, but they could not find a place to stay. They're like, you can't stay at Kelso cabin, we're full. It's the middle of July in the Rockies, like we don't have any place for you. So they knew they'd have to walk back down to Jennings Hotel. So here's a picture of, this is how people used to climb Gray's Peak in their Victorian outfits. I'm like, wow. So he said they did get all the way up there, like out of that willow car so they could see Gray's. And that is their fine view of Gray's Peak then. And then this, oops, is the picture I took. I tried to match exactly like the photo. And so they came, these are the plants that they collected that day, because not only were they trying to find a place to stay that night, because they knew he could not walk all the way from the Jennings Hotel all the way to the summit in one day. I mean, he was already struggling because he was older and he was from England and he was not used to the altitude. So I tried to clip out like his original handwriting to label each plant, but just this one took me like a whole afternoon, so I'm like, sorry everyone, I just have to, I'm gonna go with just type it up. But it's so cute. He is such a sweet man. He gets all excited about every single plant, so I put the plant name that he wrote, and he starts putting exclamation points after every single thing he sees. And then he writes, splendid, and then this is what this plant used to be called, but now we have a different name, and he's like, white and wine colored. That's the penstemon that he saw. He saw this Primula perii, and he thought it was fine. And then this is the death camas Zygodinus elegans. They're collecting all these plants along the way and putting it in their press. Oops. They found Pedicularis, both Groenlandica and Peria, that's named after Perry. So I was collecting all these plants along the way too. I just went through his journal. I made a list and collected everything that he did. And this is Claytonia. It used to be called Arctica, but now it's Negerhyza. Silene caulis. And then at the end of the first day, he was like, we went up to this valley just above the timberline. I'm sure you all have climbed Gray's Peak. That very first, it looks like a little footpath and it branches off just after this rock pile. That's the little trail that takes you up. It winds up Kelso Ridge and you end up at Kelso Mine, where that big mine entrance still is. They did not go up there. They just were still here and they're like, okay, we gotta start heading back down because it's getting kind of late. And he says there was Swerdia perennis in bogs, and that is one of my, this is the boggy ground. It's still all wet from snowmelt. And that is Swerdia perennis. It's in the gentian family. It's just one of my absolute favorite alpine plants. Such a beautiful purple plant, and I love its structures. Oops. So now it's July 21st. They stayed that night at Jennings Hotel, and then they decided, like, okay, now today, instead of going back up Gray's Peak, let's hike along Grizzly Gulch, because that was it had a huge road. They were using mules and wagons, and they ran into some miners. And with the help of Christine, she showed me that the mining engineer was Mr. Thomas West, and she taught me that this mine was called the Bertha mine. There's a lot of different mines on Gray's Peak. That part is just very confusing to me. There's just like dozens of mines, and I don't know which one. But anyway, he said that they stopped at a miner's house, and then these miners said, oh, you want to see some really beautiful flowers? Come with us. And they hiked way up, probably to that mine on the side of Torrey's Peak. And this house right here, I talked about it with Jan Wingate, who's our former curator of our our herbarium, she was there with me one day, and this is Lorraine Yates, who has been a volunteer in our herbarium for over 50 years. And they both think that that's the house that the miners stayed in, and it's because they both own horses. And Jan says that whole first floor of that building is horse stables. She's like, these aren't rooms, and they probably lived above it. And they both said that they thought that the miners would have had to bring their horses or mules in at night because of mountain lions. And so I'm not sure about this structure, but it's a possibility that that is where they ate their lunch and met with them. So on the way to Grizzly Gulch, that is one of my favorite plant hikes in the entire world. I love Grizzly Gulch. They have everything from these boggy plants like calthas, and then the arnica is just like, you just see this yellow, beautiful sheet like in the forest. Uh-oh. I can't do. Then we see veronicas, androsaces, sedum rhodanthums. This is one of, now we're getting up high. Like this is a very high elevation plant, Polemonium conferta.
A gem.
A gem. Primula angustifolia. This down here is a saxifraga chrysantha. It almost looks like a sempervivum, like hens and chicks that we grow, but it's about that big. And I have a picture of the, whoops.
Is
You
that,
hear that chirping?
is that,
No, that's my books.
Oh. Oh,
So sorry.
What did I do? That's okay. This is a willow. Salix is willow. Arnica, and that is one of the plants that Eastwood collected. One of the two plants she collected, they were both willows. This is a plant called Geum rossii. That is the plant you see all over the Alpine. It's kind of like a ground cover almost. And right over here, that's Silenia caulis again. Here we've got one of my favorite alpine clovers, Trifolium nanum. It's called Trifolium nanum because, do you see the 3-leaf? Like 1, 2, 3. There's also Trifolium perrii, which is much bigger at lower elevations. But these plants are all like 1/2 inch to 1 inch high. Okay, so then they went back, they started back down to Jennings Hotel. And who did they meet but Mr. Thomas West? And he's like, hey guys, I've heard that you two are walking around and you want to summit Gray's Peak. He said, I have a small hut, like a little log cabin, that's up in the valley at the foot of Gray's Peak. And it would be the perfect place for you to stay because if you stay there the night, it's only like 2 hours up to the very summit of Gray's Peak. Would you like to come with me? I'll hike up there with you and spend the night there with you. And then I'm gonna go back down in the morning because I have to work, but it would make it really easy for you to get to the summit. And of course they were like, yeah. So this is when I was on my hike that day, and I'm like, I know I'll never find this cabin. I'll never ever see ruins. I mean, I could walk into this valley and, I'm sure they've been like, all the wood has biodegraded into the earth and I'll probably never find it. So I was hiking up the trail and I got to that one part where you have all those big black rocks, those big granite rocks, and you kind of have to scramble. The trail, it's not really a trail, it's just like a little rock scramble for a while. And this is like well below the fork to Torrey's. And so I just was like, here I am in the rocks, I'm looking at these rocks and I'm like, it was somewhere in here, it's zoomed in and I just kept zooming and zooming and zooming. And see this little thing of snow here, and then this is water. And right next to it, I saw the cabin ruins. Yay! I screamed so loud. I was like, oh my God! And then I was like taking pictures of it, and there was this lady hiking like right up behind me. And I'm carrying, like I'm wearing my, we're required when we're doing plant collection in the field to wear one of those yellow high visibility vests. I have my bright blue, like our field presses are bright blue so we can see them. And she's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, oh, I'm just taking pictures of that cabin down there. And she's like, that's not a cabin, it's just some old miner's hut. I'm like, perfect, that's what I'm looking for. So, I mean, I don't want to tell you guys what to do, but I think that this would be an awesome thing for you to make into a landmark. I mean, I'm going to hike up there next summer, and I'm going to go into this bog, and I want to go look at it.
Get us the GPS.
Okay, I will. So anyway, that was like the most exciting discovery of my life. I saw some cabin ruins.
Most researchers don't stumble on these things quite as quickly as you do.
I know, it was,
It's great.
it was just because I was like, maybe my phone would help me like zoom in a little bit. So here's where those rocks are. That's where I was, like past these rocks is where I looked down and saw the cabin. So the three of them hiked up there, they spent the night. Alice Eastwood made pancakes the next day. There was some bacon and some coffee. And then Wallace is like, look, I'm going to start hiking because, it's going to take me a while and you can just hang out here at the cabin and like start. So she's always like concerned with these domestic pursuits. Like she always wants to like wash dishes and like tidy up and stuff. So she did that, and then she started hiking, and then it only took about 2.5 hours to the summit. And on the way there, they saw some more of my favorite high elevation alpines, the Nisio soldanella. This is one of my very favorite plants, alpine forget-me-not. It's a little cushion plant. This is like a cushion plant community in a fell field. This is called the Old Man of the Mountain, Tetraneurus grandiflora. Back then it was Actinella grandiflora. And they both said this was like the most amazing hike. They had no rain, beautiful clouds, blue sky, and I also think it's really cute that she says that she could see mountains hundreds of miles away, and I'm like, that mountain's about 20 miles away, but And then, so they got to the summit of Grace Peak at 9:30. They didn't really collect anything on the way up, of course, because they wanted to like not have to carry it all the way up and all the way back down. So they got to the summit, they looked around, they started collecting on the way back down. They got back to that cabin at noon. I don't know if they ate lunch, but these are some of the plants that they collected. Saxifraga flagellaris. This little gentian is about that big. It's about 1/4 of an inch, like from one tip of that petal to the other. This is Bessia alpina, which is the most beautiful little plant. People think it's a willow sometimes until they see how purple the petals are. This is the tiniest willow that we have in all of botany. Reticulata variety Nana. The leaves are also about maybe 5/16 of an inch. I really zoomed in. Usually we put like pennies or quarters so people can get a sense of how small these plants really are. This is one of my favorite, named for James, Chinophilia jamesii. Here's the Saxifraga chrysantha with its little sempervivum-like leaves. This is a phlox, Phlox condensata. There's several species of phlox all over the alpine. This is the smallest. And then here's 3 more. This one right here is in the lily family, and it just has a long, slender, grass-like leaf that goes above the flower. Then you see the little white flower, and then another grassy leaf is below the flower. And then this is called Alpine Chiming Bells, Mertensia alpina. And this is like my greatest horticultural achievement. These are very rare plants. The alpine poppy, it's the only alpine poppy that we have in the state of Colorado. And this plant is about 1 or 2 inches high. It was really windy. I was way up high, almost, I was at the point where it forks to Torrey's Peak. And there is just a whole field of these things over to the left of the trail as you're coming down. And see, like, he put question mark, exclamation point, exclamation. He's like, is this really it? Like, he knew too, like, what he was seeing. So now, like, the afternoon is over, and Mr. West had left, like, at the beginning of the morning. He's like, I'm going to work, but there is a shortcut for you to get back to Grizzly Gulch. Go, he was like pointing, go to that ridge, see the mine, go up and over that ridge, take our mule track, and then you'll come out over the side, like right there, and then you'll see the trail coming back down, and just take it down back to Grizzly Gulch in our cabin. Because they were going to go spend the night with the miners. Well, they got lost, horribly lost. They could not find the trail. There were all these trees that had fallen down, huge logs. They're carrying plants. She's wearing all these skirts. He's 67 and exhausted. And I'm like, thank God. I don't know how, he didn't write anything in his journal about how they actually found their way back. But she did talk about, this is Colin pointing to where we think they got lost. Like, they must have gotten lost in those trees. But we think that they found, whoops, sorry. They must have listened and found the creek and followed it down. But by this time, it's dark out. And I wanted to show this picture in my presentation because it is a very treacherous creek. Like, they're not walking on a trail, and there's all this like washout falling down. The logs are slippery. And I did look up the moon that night because I was thinking, well, maybe there was a full moon and there would be at least some light. But it was just a very beginning crescent moon, a new moon that didn't have any, there was no light at all. So I don't know how they made it back. I'm very thankful that they were okay. And they finally got back to the cabin, and Mr. West felt so bad. He's like, here, put my nightgown on. And Eastwood again wants to get all clean and beautiful and wash her face and comb her hair. But when Wallace in his journal writes the word tired, that is the first and only time he ever complains at all, like in his entire trip in North America. And he then wrote a letter to his wife that I read, and he was like, oh my gosh. And I mean, he was delighted with like his whole trip, but that was just, you know, really scary. And I'm so glad that they made it back okay. And then the next morning, Sunday, July 24th, they hiked around, like they just went back and kind of looked at stuff. They didn't like climb up anything because they were exhausted. And their train left the next day on Monday. and they got back to the hotel. This hotel is also on 17th Street, and I think that was the Union Station train hotel, because the Oxford wasn't built yet, and there wasn't another hotel around. This was the closest one to the train station. Alice Eastwood and her father came, and they all went out to dinner because Wallace was going to get on the train and go back home. So they had this friendship formed, and these two wrote to each other for the rest of their lives. Wallace lived to be about 90, and Alice Eastwood continued to write to him and send him seeds and letters throughout her life, because he became a rock gardener. He loved alpines, and it became his hobby. He built a rock garden and a bog garden at his house in England. And their correspondence is just so much fun to read. So Alice Eastwood, now she is not famous yet, but this is her time when she, it was about 3 years later in 1891 when she moved to California and started working at the herbarium at the San Francisco Academy. I kind of feel like her trip with Wallace really changed the path of her life. She gave up her teaching career and she just focused on botany. She wanted to learn all about our western flora, including California, so that's why she moved out there when the Brandegees offered her the job. This is a picture of the Academy inside. It's built like the Brown Palace Hotel with the atrium and the all the way around the railings. It was about 6 stories high. And this building was on Market Street between 4th and 5th. Here's a picture of a guy with a bear. It's kind of an awkward photo, but they had lots of taxidermy all over the Academy, and the herbarium was up on the 6th floor. This is a photo that they discovered was taken the afternoon, the day before the earthquake in 1906. And this reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle had just bought a new camera for work, and he was just going around the city taking photos. So he has a nice record of, there's like 100 shots of all these different parts of San Francisco. Here's Market Street, right before the earthquake. And there's this other wonderful film that was made, and it's available on the, what is that thing? The National Gallery, or the National Library in Washington, D.C. What's that one? The National Archives. That's right. Come on, Christine.
But everybody would know the National Archives.
They hooked a camera and they let it run on the front of a streetcar, and it goes all the way from one end of Market Street all the way down to the other. And there's all these cars like crossing the tracks, and these people, these amazing historians they were like, when was this film made? And they looked up every single license plate that they could see. And the license plate that was closest to the day of the earthquake had only been issued like 6 days before the earthquake. And then in the movie, you see all these rain puddles, and it had been very, very dry, and it only rained the day before the earthquake. So they're like, this must be taken the day before the earthquake, and we get this whole shot of Market Street, including the California Academy of Sciences. So Alice Eastwood was living right up there on Taylor and Washington Street. The earthquake, she woke up at 5 in the morning every day for work. She was eating her breakfast or getting ready or whatever, and she did feel the like, earthquake, oh no. And, but she didn't realize like how bad it really was. She walked to work at about 6 and she got to work. This is Market Street later that day where it's just complete chaos. People are trying to get horse and wagon to like get their things and their possessions out of buildings. There were a lot of hurt people. They were trying to like rescue people who were like underneath buildings and rubble. This is the inside of the California Academy. I think a few days later. They didn't have a picture in there for a while. And so Alice Eastwood was outside the front of the building, and she saw some of the men that she worked with, and she's like, can you please help me? Let's go inside the academy. I want to save the type specimen cabinet, which is in every herbarium. They have, the whole thing is arranged like a library alphabetically. First they have the family, then they have the genus, then they have the species, and each one has its own folder. So in one plant, like we saw Bessia alpina, a herbarium can have anywhere from 1 to 100 sheets in there. But the manager of the herbarium goes through each one and selects the perfect page, the perfect collection that you could use to write a description from for your native flora book. And she had separated all those out and put them in a special cabinet, and nobody had ever done that before. So she had all the type specimen cabinet, and every herbarium in the whole world has that. We have ours, and it's right in the front, and that's the first thing that gets rescued. Because otherwise your herbarium is like gone forever. So she climbed up, they had the railings, it's not in the picture, but they had fallen down and they used them like ladders because the staircase was full of rubble. And they climbed up all these railings and they lowered the type specimen cabinet down to the floor, but they couldn't like lift the whole thing because there were 1,500 specimens in it. So they had bundles, like 8 different bundles, and she got them all out, and the first thing she did was take them back to her house. This is all in a letter that she wrote to Dr. Britton of the Harvard Herbarium. And so she saved everything she could. Later on that day, she paid a driver $14 to drive her to the that big, where all the boats come in San Francisco. It's like near Pier 39, and now it's a big farmer's market with the
Fisherman's
big
Wharf?
white tower.
Fisherman's Wharf? Or?
Yeah, it's near Fisherman's Wharf. And then she ended up living in Berkeley for a while. After this happened, the whole city caught on fire. This is what happened afterwards, because after there was just ruins, you know, there were aftershocks, and then everything started coming down. There was the massive fire. And then this is like Market Street, right after the earthquake. It was just a horrible, horrible event in their lives. But she wrote this letter to her friend, the doctors Britton in Harvard. And I tried to read some of it one of the other times I gave this presentation, and I couldn't read it. I wanted to start crying because it's just so traumatizing. And this is a picture of Nob Hill. Right in here is where Alice lived. And you can see that just like everything's been burned down and flattened. So for the next probably 11 years, she traveled around the world. She went to England and visited Wallace. She went to all these different herbariums because when they rebuilt the academy, it's now in the middle of Golden Gate Park. She became the head of the herbarium again and was the head of the herbarium until she passed away. She never retired. She lived until she was 90, and in 1953 is when she passed away at 94. Sorry, not 90. And she collected over 300,000 herbarium specimens in her lifetime, which I've been collecting for 12 years, and I only have like 800, so it's like, I'll never get there. But and her original 1,400 specimens that were taken in Colorado are at the CU Boulder Herbarium. And you can look at them online on the SciNet website. And I just want to show you a picture. This is Wallace in his later years and his daughter Violet, and both families wrote each other letters on and on and on forever. And the Wallace Correspondence Project is a really fun thing that I'm sure all of you would love to read, because there's just so many fun letters that he wrote to all these famous people. He kind of, as he grew older, he started becoming more and more involved in spiritualism, and he wanted to believe that we could communicate with spirits and the dead. That was a very popular pastime back then, and he said the biggest crowd he ever drew was his talk to this spiritualism association. He got paid $149, and there were over 1,000 people there. And they wanted to hear his views on spiritualism. So I think he kind of, I don't want to say he fell out of favor, but I think the other members of the scientific community just kind of like questioned him a little bit. But now he's coming back. There's this book called The Feather Thief that many of you may have read, and it talks all about his collections and what happened with them. It's a really fun book to read if you ever get a chance. So I just wanted to end our story with some pictures of Gray's Peak that I just took here and there. Steep slopes. Oops. There's where we were coming up on the cabin. And then this is the picture I took the first morning out there by myself, because Colin and the interns were coming from Vail and I was coming from Denver, so I left super early at like 4 in the morning, and I climbed up to the top, and I was looking all around for the little sign that you can hold, and I didn't even see it until the other day. It's like right there. I was like, oh, but that's my beautiful sunrise picture. And then I just have one last, oh, that's in my living room, my plant press, all my plants. And then this is my thank you page. And I'd really like to thank Christine Bradley for all of her help.
And thank you, this was such fun. So let's give Amy applause. So one thing for all of you who've been coming to Devil's Gate in terms of decades, if you've been doing this forever and ever, one of your slides mentioned Dr. William A. Weber from CU, and we have his presentation is available on the Library Archives digital page. It's his, and he's talking about the similarities of plants at this altitude and in Russia and other places. Anyway.
Yeah,
but
he was a professor at CU, and he wrote, when you work in botany, they have the flora of the state. So our Colorado flora was written by William Weber, and we followed that for years. Now we have a new one by Jennifer Ackerfield, our Colorado native flora, and that's what we have to follow. And they'll change things around, they'll push things together, they'll be like, this isn't actually a different species, these are all the same. But you have to follow it, and that's how you key out plants. It's called a dichotomous key, where you're like, is it this or this, A or B? Okay, go to number 7, A or B, and it just leads you through all these choices until you key out the plant and find the species.
But it's, and the fact that you're here, obviously botanists up here are just part of our history. We look at our buildings and everything else, but the botanists who are here early, and what a wonderful adventure it would have been for them to come up. So thank you for continuing.
Thank you so much, you guys.